Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Beyond the Microscope series. My name is Olu Ibrahim. I'm the founder and executive director of Kids in Tech. We'd love to know where everybody's coming from today. So please introduce yourself in the chat, tell us your name and where in the world you are joining us from today. I also want to highlight that live closed captioning is available for this webinar. Please press the live transcript button on your bottom right should you wish to view your webinar this way. Since our founding in 2016, Kids in Tech has been committed to exciting, educating, and empowering children to acquire the skills and confidence in technology through interactive after-school programs. Our programs focus on helping kids develop the necessary tech skills and aptitudes to participate and be future leaders of the 21st century. Due to the confluence of historical crises, greatly exacerbated by COVID-19, it's important now more than ever that we explore what does the future of education hold for our nation's children? And how do we ensure that all of our children reach their full potential? This four-part webinar series is dedicated to topics about education, science, technology, innovation, and business through the voices of folks directly involved in those fields. The goal of this webinar is to spark conversation and discussion and how we can all work together to ensure our children are all successful. Today in our third webinar, we'll explore the state of STEM education, with the federal government making historical investments in education. We'll explore the importance and the role policy plays in this. Policies are the tools in hand of the government to bring about change. And to bring change in education, the leaders who make education policies for schools, state, or country, also known as education policymakers, are responsible. Policymakers play a very significant role in the education system, as every component in the system gets implemented based on their decisions. This webinar will also have a discussion with our esteemed panelists and guests, and we'll talk about these topics in further detail. And now our sincere thanks to our generous partners who made this series possible, SoftWorld and the Boston Globe. SoftWorld is an award-winning national staffing and solutions firm, largely focused in high-tech, engineering, and life science industries. SoftWorld recognizes the inclusion gap within the STEM fields and strongly believes in the need to provide opportunities to those that are historically have not had them. By empowering these individuals with the skills and advancement opportunities, we can begin to address both the inequity in the space as well as a looming national STEM skills shortage. Thank you to SoftWorld. And a special thanks to our media sponsor, the Boston Globe, for our webinar series. The Boston Globe is a 26-time Pulitzer Prize winning news source featuring premium and national news content daily. With the largest news source in the region, the Boston Globe provides more news, analysis, and information about community events, sports, and the entertainment than any other local news source. Thank you to the Boston Globe. And now a word from Lauren Jones, Executive Vice President at the Massachusetts Business Roundtable.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon. The Massachusetts Business Roundtable is pleased to be a supporter and sponsor for today's series. We are an organization comprised of CEOs and senior executives representing major employers across the state. You'll actually hear from one of our members, Jamie, on today's panel. The mission of our organization is to bring together executives from the business community to strengthen the state's economy and way of doing business by public policy. And as we think about public policy to support education and our workforce development, STEM education and STEAM education is at the heart of that. And so as we think about pathways from K through 12 and beyond to help spark that interest in a child's exploration within science, technology, engineering, art, and math, we know that conversations like today, as well as ongoing opportunities to create pathways and exploration for students to pursue careers in STEM and STEAM is essential to our economy and our future workforce. So we're delighted to be a part of this program today and collaborating with Kids in Tech. Thank you.
Thank you again to Lauren and the Mass Business Roundtable. Now it's time to dive into today's panel. Everyone, you're in for a treat. As part of the program, we 55-minute panel discussion. Please put your Q&A questions in the chat box, and we will try to get to as many of them throughout the course of this discussion. And now I'd like to introduce you to our moderator, Felicia Gans. Felicia Gans is the digital producer for the Boston Globe's K-12 education coverage, including the Great Divide team that explores the deep inequities in our public education system. She oversees digital products and strategy, manages social media for the section stories, and operates the education section front. Felicia also reports for the team, usually focused on breaking and developing stories. Additionally, Felicia anchors the Coronavirus Now newsletter on weekdays and sporadically writes obituaries for the Boston Globe. She began working at the Boston Globe in 2015 while she was working in college, mostly in the Metro section as a breaking news reporter on weekends and evenings. Felicia is a graduate of Boston University. Welcome, Felicia.
Thanks for having me, Olu. And I am going to introduce our panelists in a moment. But before we get started with that, if you have not yet filled out our word cloud that we put in the chat earlier, we asked everyone to tell us what field they are currently in. And we're about to put up a second question. There will be another link in the chat in a moment asking you what field you thought you were going to work in as a child. That can be whether you were 5, it can be when you were 15. The goal is before you entered your career or entered the field you're in, we're trying to get a sense of what people thought that they were going to do. So that question will come up in a moment and that link will be in the chat. In the meantime, I'm going to start introducing our panelists. So first we have Natasha Ushamirsky. Natasha is the state director for Massachusetts at the Education Trust. In this role, she supports and facilitates the work of the Massachusetts Education Equity Partnership, a collective effort of social justice, civil rights, and education advocates from across the Commonwealth who are working together to promote educational equity for historically underserved students in our state. Natasha has been with the Education Trust for more than a decade and previously served as Ed Trust's National Director of K-12 Policy. An immigrant and a former English teacher, she is committed to helping improve our education system so that all students get the learning experiences and supports that they need to soar. Natasha holds a master's in education policy and management from the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a bachelor's in economics and Spanish language and literature from Brandeis. Thanks for being with us, Natasha. Next up is Seema Rivera. Seema is an assistant professor of STEM education at Clarkson University. She's also the principal investigator of Clarkson's National Science Foundation NOISE program. Seema prepares science, math, and tech students to become secondary teachers and also works with STEM faculty at universities on educational research. Her areas of research include STEM education, equity and diversity in STEM, and teacher identity. She's also on the school board. She's also the school board president of her local school district in Guilderland, New York. And lastly, we have Jamie Paris-Boisvert. Jamie is the general manager for Siemens Smart Infrastructure in the Eastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island markets, where she has the responsibility for leading strategy, sales, and operational activities. Jamie and her team work closely with clients to deliver solutions that optimize buildings and infrastructure by improving energy efficiency, data collection and analysis, comfort, safety, and security. This approach allows clients to realize lower energy costs and increase building values, as well as garner recognition for corporate and social responsibility in the communities in which they operate. Thank you to all of our panelists for being here. We're going to give you just one more moment to fill out this word cloud, and then we are going to show you the answers. Do we have the word cloud ready for the first field? Let's see. Okay, so here it is. So it's interesting, the field that that most people are in is probably unsurprising because of the event that we have here today: education, higher education, healthcare. We see K-12 education, education nonprofit, educational outreach. So that's great. So we have a lot of people here that are working to educate, likely not just kids, but also adults to help them get into the workforce and get into STEM fields. Hopefully you all had a moment to fill out this second one. Let's put up the second word cloud, see what the result is. Let's see if we have it. Okay, here we go. So this is interesting. And this is there's a couple reasons that we wanted to do these word clouds and compare them with each other. One of them is because we like getting to know you. Webinar style, we don't get to see your faces, so it's a way for us to understand who's here. But one of the things that we're going to talk about today is opportunity and opportunity gaps in STEM fields in particular. A lot of people change careers from their career dreams as a kid to actually entering that career just because our personalities change. That is natural. But for a lot of kids, it's opportunity based. It's not knowing how to pursue that field. It's not having the activities or the opportunities to spark that passion. And we wanted to give you all a moment to consider whether that happened to you, whether you have students that you feel that's happening to, and hopefully today we'll be able to discuss how we can fill those gaps. So we're going to start with our first question, start and jump into the discussion. The skills gained from STEM education extend beyond those just needed to be successful in STEM fields. It has to do with preparing children with varied interests to move into any industry and have valuable skill sets from STEM to allow them to be successful. I'd love to hear from all of you about what you think the benefit of STEM education is for the nation's youth, for elementary, middle school, and high school level, and also for post-secondary and young adults, no matter what field they end up entering. And whoever wants to, Natasha, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, happy to jump in. So as Felicia mentioned, I've been working at the Education Trust for going on 14 years now. We're a nonprofit advocacy organization squarely focused on eliminating disparities within our education system. And at the core of that work, as well as at the core of our work with the Massachusetts Education Equity Partnership, is really the belief that the job of our education system is to open as many doors and as many opportunities for students as possible, so that students themselves, after graduation from high school, are prepared to enter whatever field they want to, right? They can choose between college and the workforce rather than sort of be shuttled into one or the other. And as we just saw from the word clouds, I think that reinforces this idea of why kind of expanding opportunity to all sorts of fields, and STEM is an area where we see some pretty significant disparities in opportunity for our students of color, our economically disadvantaged students, our immigrant youth, and our students with disabilities. When we were kids, most of us didn't know what we would be doing. I personally didn't even know the field I'm working in, the job that I'm doing right now, even existed. I also did not know that how much math would be involved in the work that I do right now. So I think for all of those reasons, personally, kind of exposing kids to as many STEM opportunities as possible throughout their educational career is critical. If we think more kind of on a societal level too, I mean, think about the moment that we're in right now. Don't think we have to go much further than that to think about comment on the importance of STEM. We're at a tail end, hopefully, of this pandemic. It's absolutely devastating year. And the reason that we see light at the end of the tunnel is science, right? And throughout this past year, we have seen, all of us firsthand, the importance of not only being able to use a variety of technology kind of to connect with other people and so forth, but also the ability to consume scientific information, and really kind of to distinguish between what's real and what was not real, right? And so that's just another reason kind of grounding us again in this moment that we're in now, in terms of why this work is so critical.
I'd like to jump in, Natasha, to add to that. I think not only to be just a member of society is important to have a strong understanding of STEM. I think from an employer's perspective, there's almost no job out there at this point that doesn't require a certain level of STEM understanding. And I think coming from a field that was strongly based in the trades in the decades in the past, where the focus on technology in particular wasn't necessarily part of that, it has expanded dramatically over the course of particularly the last decade. And I think the skill set that we're looking from people entering the workforce now versus what we were hiring 10 or 15 years ago is very different. And so even if that's not an area of interest for a student from elementary, middle, or post-secondary, it is something that they're going to need in some capacity. So I think from a workforce standpoint, making sure that STEM is fundamental. and also to be an educated member of society as well. But certainly, I think for career moving forward.
I just wanted to add, I think learning in STEM and doing work in STEM has you thinking curiously, tinkering, innovative thinking, and all of these kinds of skills are long-lasting, developing skills that you want to carry on, no matter what, wherever you are in the workplace. One thing that stands out to me is about learning from failures and thinking about inclusivity and exclusivity in STEM. I think we don't always do a great job in the country teaching about failures along the way until, a lot of times STEM is taught in a way that we see the end result. And I think Natasha said it perfectly that basically this past year, we've seen science play out in front of us. And we've seen what can happen if people work across lines together. People work with different people from all over parts of the world and have to communicate and be creative and efficient, persistent, resilience, have resiliency. All of these things are skills that are developed by doing work in the STEM field or learning in STEM. We're also thinking about jobs and preparing our students for jobs that don't exist yet, or automation is there. So these are things that can be developed over time, and more specific content can be learned, right, at different workplaces. But these other critical thinking skills are the ones that are really essential in STEM and that build on each other year after year.
I love how the three of you build on each other because you all really do see different ends of where STEM makes a difference and how it can impact people. And we've talked and we read a lot about how STEM really is this all hands on deck approach. You can't just have kids learning about it in school and then going home and not having the kinds of fun experiences that ignite the passion. You can't, same with college students, you can't have them learning about it in class, but not have the opportunities to get workforce training. I'd love to hear from you about how that all hands on deck approach is incorporated, and also whose job it really is to oversee it, what the federal government's role has been in STEM, and how it seems like the new administration will be organizing and staffing their STEM education response.
So I'm happy to kick us off on that one. And, I think the first thing to note right off bat, right, is that the federal government's role in education in the United States, the way our system is structured, is frankly relatively limited, right? The federal government funds about 10% of education costs in a typical year. The federal government is very good at leveraging that 10% of funding to affect change. One of the ways that they do that is by attaching certain requirements to the money that goes out into the field, right? So that's one of the things that the federal government can do, is sort of steer the ship. And from a broad perspective through the bully pulpit, frankly, through the kind of public speaking and the platform that the Secretary of Education, for example, has to elevate these issues. A key role of the federal government is to protect the civil rights of students. And that really is one of the core responsibilities of the federal government. There are a number of ways that the US Department of Education does this, for example, and through federal legislation, we see this done. One is through requiring disaggregation of data, so that we can shine a light on disparities where they exist, because you can't address problems that you cannot see, right? So that's one of the things. And the civil rights data collection has been really critical. It's an initiative of the US Department of Education that collects district level data on, for example, access to math and science courses. When it comes to shining a light, again, that's been really important. They also handle civil rights complaints when there are inequities in access that students experience. This is a venue that individual families, that advocates can pursue to correct disparities and inequities in systems, in education systems. And finally, the role of the federal government can also be to share information, share research, fund research and evaluation projects, but also just disseminate information about what works, about what effective practices, and that hopefully can inform the way that this work happens on the ground.
Jamie, what are you seeing in the STEM workforce in terms of what federal and local government response has been? And what has the response been also to the way that the pandemic has affected the workforce? And has the STEM workforce been specifically prioritized in any of that response?
I think there's an opportunity there. When the pandemic happened, we were coming into the pandemic, at least in Massachusetts, we had record low unemployment, and so there were challenges, I think, in terms of workforce development surrounding that. But now the pandemic has created a different challenge where there are millions of jobs that are, across the country that are unlikely to come back the way that they were. So I think many workers are going to be transitioning into new industries, and from a policy standpoint, more than ever, the country needs an inclusive workforce development agenda that brings more people into the process and doesn't leave anyone behind, basically pointing to the things that Natasha identified. And from a corporate perspective, we see an opportunity specifically for community colleges and technical training centers to provide that accessible, affordable post-secondary education opportunity, and that this really is at the heart of workforce development, not only now post-pandemic or nearly post-pandemic, but long term. I think it's key that these institutions have the resources they need to partner with businesses and keep their pathways open so that workers can rapidly upskill when opportunities like this come up. I also think there's a corporate responsibility that companies like Siemens need to continue in investing in lifelong learning, so that when we're hiring, we're looking for candidates that aren't being left out of recruiting pools due to unnecessary four-year degree requirements. In the past, particularly being an engineering company, that was a prerequisite. And what we're finding is that there's skill and talent out there that doesn't necessarily require that four-year degree, that we can do training on the job. And more broadly, I think there's opportunities for things like youth apprenticeships, where we can within the organization, more use of digital tools to rapidly retrain workers, and emphasis on, like I said, the value of transferable skills, where life experience or previous work skills that we can bring into a current role. So overall, from a policy standpoint, I think some of it is specific to pandemic response, but there's some broad focus on that ability to quickly retrain and reskill.
One of the issues that comes up a lot when we talk about education opportunity, and especially STEM education, is the digital divide and what students are able to do on their own. It came up, it was really exacerbated, I would say, by the pandemic and the fact that kids were spending more time than ever at home and education was largely happening on your own. Seema, what are you seeing on the local level as far as how that digital divide takes effect in communities?
I think, thinking about it in all hands on deck approach is a great way to look at it. Like Natasha mentioned, the federal government only plays a small part of the funding in these schools, but they have the opportunity to leverage, their relationships with different organizations. And so, for example, when the pandemic hit, we knew that there was a digital divide and that broadband was not all over the US, but it really highlighted the lack of broadband all over the country. And then that became an access and equity issue right away. Because once we saw how many people did not have access to jobs, education, all different kinds of opportunities that were only offered online, it became a bigger issue to fight for broadband to be a utility. And it's still not a utility, but that is where the federal government could play a bigger part in making that change. Also, the federal government, I think, has like a interesting 30,000 kind of, bird's eye view of the whole country. And so they can see STEM as the foundation of protecting our environment, protecting our country. Somebody mentioned big data before, fostering equity, even modernizing our infrastructure. And then more specifically this past year with cybersecurity, which has always been important, but I think in the past year, as more and more organizations and schools have gone online because of the pandemic, the number of cyber attacks have gone up drastically. And then just also their support in terms of STEM. I think Natasha mentioned supporting science and math courses. They know that that is an economic issue, that there's a STEM relationship between doing well in STEM and getting a job later on. And so just even sending that visual message of showing up at a science fair, or basically using their visibility to show that STEM is important. That makes a big difference. And so at least from the federal government, that is their role. Do you want me to go into the local one too?
Sure. I mean, I'd love to hear on the local level what can be done. And we actually got a question from one of the people watching about what, aside from running for local school board, in a sense, what can school boards do? And in a sense, what can community members do? What is the local response? And also, how should the local response and maybe the state and federal response, overlap?
Yeah, so especially at the local government, I think a lot of organizations and schools can make declarations and make statements about what is important to them and what they prioritize. And I think, now I don't recommend everybody to do school board, but even if you're a member in the community, you can hold schools and organizations accountable. The one awesome thing I think about this country is we have the ability to speak up and speak out about things that matter to us. And so show up to your local school district's board meetings and speak up for what you think is important. If you don't see, good offerings of STEM classes, or you see that the school districts could be leveraging organizations like the public library or universities that are nearby, go and speak up. Sometimes it's not even a matter of, oh, they're not interested, but until people show interest and there's power in numbers. If you go and speak up, then they will take interest. And I think there's a real grassroots effort this past year with the pandemic, with all the inequities and access issues that have come up, that I think people are realizing they have more power than they think, and you don't have to start from the top to bottom. You can go to your local public school district and make public comments and continue to push and push, and you'll be heard.
When it comes to, oh, Natasha, I had one quick question for Seema. I just wanted to ask, when it comes to opportunity, the kinds of things that the students that you're teaching at Clarkson, when they come to you and they say, I'm interested in STEM education, this is something I do have a passion in, what are the kinds of opportunities that they had that you think leads to that passion and leads to people wanting to pursue careers? What are the things that school committees should be asking for and should be creating in their schools?
First, a deeper understanding of STEM, I think I mentioned this before, that there's a path of learning, right? Like everything is not just going to come so easily. And so understanding that there's great opportunity in failure, and so kind of turning that mindset. Also having the idea of being culturally responsive to who is in front of you. So if you're going to be a teacher, and we know that classrooms are becoming more and more diverse, but the faculty are not, thinking about who are you teaching, what are their interests, and get to know what that is first, and then get to the content. It's a lot easier being a teacher and having a good relationship with your students and then teaching them the content versus just being really good at teaching the content. And then lastly, I think having a rigorous curriculum. I think this past year we had to move a lot of things online or hybrid, but that didn't have to change the rigor of some of the curriculum. There were, some people thought about it as a learning loss, but there were a lot of opportunities that did come up. And I am hoping that local schools and organizations take those silver linings from this COVID year and carry them forward.
Natasha, I didn't mean to cut you off before. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Just going to say a couple of things about advocacy. As Seema said, certainly, running for school board, great. If you want to get engaged that way, that's awesome. Not everyone is going to be in a position where they can do that. I think each and every one of us, each community member, every parent, right, all of us can be advocates. All of us can be advocates for all kids. One of the most powerful things that we can do is ask questions. Come to those school committee meetings and ask about what opportunities are being made available. Ask about barriers to those opportunities. When a class is available, what are the requirements to actually enroll? Who's in those classes? What do our data look like? What do our disaggregated data look like right now, right? And then, this stuck with me from years ago, an advocate, a brilliant advocate that I'd spoken with, who said, you want to know a district's priorities, follow the money. So get engaged in those budget conversations, find out how resources are being allocated and spent. Which schools are they going to within a district? Because all too often we see that our wealthier schools, even within the same district, are getting more resources and more of those opportunities than the school down the road serving our less advantaged student populations. So again, just get really good at asking questions and get into those budgetary and math skills and follow the money.
A lot of good advice there. I want to talk a little bit about outside of school programming, the collectively known as after school, but it's a mix of before school, after school, summer school settings. They play a valuable role in often closing opportunity gaps for a lot of children from underserved and underrepresented communities. Of 8.4 million children currently in after school programs, ethnic minority children are more likely than others to participate. 25% of Asian, 24% of African American, 21% of Hispanic, and 16% of Native American children attend after school programs, compared to the national average of just 15% of children overall. What can state and national policymakers do to support effective K-12 STEM education programs outside of the classroom?
Well, I think I'll just jump in here first that I don't know if a lot of people know, but these after school programs or before school or summer programs really help advocate for equity and access. So when parents are working, this is where students can go to get help. They can have extra support for school. This is where they build their peer and social networks. And so we know that the more students are involved with these types of things, the better off they are academically and socially. And so these opportunities, these learning opportunities, can be think of supporting family. And so I think the local government or whichever government is involved could, do equity audits or pulses and figure out what are the learning outcomes that are happening in these after school programs and what is working well, and holding them accountable. The big piece, I think, of the after school programming is the family piece. And so if there's not large family engagement happening, have those organizations hold them accountable so they are doing that. That is a huge part in supporting students. There are also programs that start off as after school programs and then eventually they build a bridge to schools. So for example, First Robotics used to be just called First, and it used to be an after school program. And then that built a bridge to classroom, regular part of school. And from there, there's First Robotics, there's Legos and Lego Robotics, et cetera. And so having those programs might seem like they seem separate from school, but really they are a huge support in supporting public schools, but then also providing access and equity to those underserved groups that would not necessarily have that at their regular school setting.
I have a great attendee. Oh, I have a great attendee question actually that goes right off of that I think would be best for Seema. Somebody asked us, in what ways has policy been used to close racial and ethnic gaps in STEAM education K through 12 and beyond? Can you give concrete examples locally or nationwide? So what are do you have any kind of success stories in a sense, things that people could model off of?
Well, I'm thinking, we talked a little bit about policy. So for example, I think Natasha mentioned thinking about who's in classes and how do you get into classes. And so there could be options like some schools might say you need recommendation letters or you might need, X GPA to be able to attend, this honors class or advanced class, et cetera. If you change policy, and this is really a policy issue, it doesn't, cost money to change it to open enrollment. So students who are really interested, that something simple like that could change an equitable piece. Also, we use public libraries, I think, in even before COVID times to provide support for students during the summer. And I think people talk about the learning loss that happened this past year, but really you could think about it in a way of just re-engaging students in school. There was a lot of loss in terms of just being connected to their teachers and their peers, and the whole idea of being part of a community of school. And so even if it's not certain content that they're learning necessarily in the summer, just re-engaging and being recommitted to education and being part of that school community. So I think there's probably some advocacy piece involved in helping the access and equity, but there's definitely policy issues that some of it may not even cost any money, but like Natasha said, go to your schools and find out what they are, ask those questions, and then ask who's deciding that, and what push for your questions, because they're not going to change until people ask.
Yeah, this is Jamie. Just from an employer standpoint, I would encourage that type of activity both in the classroom and in after-school programming that is not that broadens the horizon rather than narrowing it for students. The reason, from a workforce standpoint, we don't know what the jobs are going to look like in the future. We can't even conceptualize what the jobs are going to be for students who are in elementary school right now. There will probably be a whole fields that will exist by the time they're in the workforce. So you can't, if we limit to those who either show interest or aptitude at this stage, we are shutting out a whole group of students or of young people who may be, making tremendous contributions to the workforce in the future. So I think it's extremely short-sighted. And whether it's an after-school program, again, making it as broad as possible. And kids, I think, I can say as a parent and as a former kid myself that I tended to do the things that people said I was good at or that I thought I was good at, and that maybe I enjoyed those more. But it shuts doors in some cases to other things. And if that constant exposure is where that, and that learning to love to learn, even if it's something that is a challenge, I think those are, from a big picture, where we're going to be and what we're going to need in the workforce, that's making driving accessibility even where there may not be interest currently is key, I think.
I think that speaks a lot to what Seema said earlier about taking away the idea of failure. Of so often in STEM fields, it's about what you said, people told you were good at something and it makes you feel like you enjoy it more. If we take away the standard of what it means to be quote unquote good at a STEM field, and it's not a pass fail, it's not all about getting grades in classes, we kind of can get to the underlying passion, it sounds like. I wanted to talk a little bit about the American Rescue Plan. It's providing billions and billions of dollars for schools across the country. And the really cool thing about it is that there's a lot of flexibility with how that money can be spent. Pieces of it are for safety and for making classrooms and school buildings safe for kids to go back to. But a lot of it also focuses on learning loss and hopefully provides schools with the opportunities to create after school or summer programs over a period of a few years too. It doesn't need to be spent right away. So there's a lot of kind of cool aspects of this. Natasha, what can schools do to utilize this funding to enhance STEM education?
A lot. So I, earlier in one of my responses had mentioned that the federal government typically funds about 10% of education, right? This is not a typical year. The federal government is making a huge investment in education right now. And the money, there's a total of about $122 billion of it, is flowing largely based on the Title I formula, which means that it is targeted to the districts of the highest need, districts serving the most economically disadvantaged students in our country. And for Massachusetts, more concretely, we're getting about $1.8 billion of that funding. For some of our districts, that is literally translating in upwards of $5,000 per child in increased resources, right? That is a huge, huge investment. The money is short term, so we have to be careful in terms of hiring for long-term positions. So if we're hiring more teachers, for example, we need a plan for how to continue to to cover their salaries after the couple of years that this funding is going to be in place. Same goes for counselors and so forth. That said, Massachusetts also has a whole separate state funding stream under the Student Opportunity Act that can help cover those costs down the line. So, in terms of specific things that districts can consider doing, about 20% of this funding has to be used to address unfinished learning, to help the kids, build up skills that maybe they didn't have a chance to work on as much this year with all of the remote learning and tech disruptions and so forth. And kind of, we know that there were some places where despite everyone's best efforts, kids did not get as much kind of time on learning as they usually do. So again, and especially when it comes to math, for example, where skills really build one on top of each other, right? They're building blocks, right? Districts can think about how to help support students in building those foundational skills, even as they continue to make progress. So this should be about acceleration, not about remediation. There are also opportunities to start new programs, right? One of the ways that we can leverage this funding is to cover startup costs. You need to purchase technology to start a new program. This is one way to use these resources, right? Purchase more lab equipment, for example, is another thing that districts could also do. So, again, some of those short-term costs, and then again, helping kids build up and continue to support those skills that maybe they didn't have a chance to master this past year are two big buckets of things that districts can do.
I'll just jump in and add to Natasha's points that thinking about what is already working at the school, and if something is not working, as opposed to just adding money and building to that, thinking about what ways the money could take away barriers that currently exist. And so thinking, a large picture, and if we're thinking specifically in STEM of how to support that, we know that there are a lot of barriers to STEM at a systemic level. And so if we want to use this money in a more long term, is how to make that structural change. And so, like Natasha mentioned, there's also a big range of what these funds can be used for. I think a huge piece probably for all students is going to be the social emotional learning and mental health needs of students, of, like I mentioned before, re-engaging back in school. And so that will be something that I think needs to be promoted. And there's that second or parallel pandemic that's also happening at the same time with racial injustice. And so here's an opportunity to jump ahead with that, right? Like Natasha said, not remediate, but accelerate. Now we see, like COVID really, I think, highlighted some drastic gaps that exist in school, and they became even more apparent with the pandemic. And so here's an opportunity to kind of fix those and remove those barriers that have been limiting. And then, the last piece is really, these are funds that are one time. So to not be short-sighted and think about how can these be best used in the long term. Because once they're gone, that's, then the district will have to pay to keep those programs running.
Thanks, Seema. Yeah, I think if we look at sort of outside specifically even of STEM programs, right? There are a number of things and a number of sort of directions that districts really need to go and focus on this year as we bring kids back to in-person learning. One is making sure that the learning environments that kids come back to are supporting and affirming all of our students. A big part of that work that we don't really think about often is representation within the curriculum and the types of assignments that kids are given, the which texts they read, whose accomplishments they learn about. Do students see themselves in their science curriculum, in their math curriculum? Do they see people who look like them doing this work? Right, that's absolutely critical in helping students see themselves and map their own path forward in their careers. As I mentioned, unfinished learning is another key part. Third component where we have the opportunity, and a pretty incredible opportunity right now to make a difference, again, thinking about representation, is in educator diversity. We know, for example, that in Massachusetts, I believe about 8% of our teachers are people of color. About 40% of our students are. And again, when we think about that mismatch and who kids see in front of the classroom and where they see themselves moving forward, this is another critical space. And there are opportunities to start new pathway programs, for example. If you as a district need to hire tutors right now to help support students, you can turn that into a grow your own program. That becomes a ground for training teachers, training folks who can become your future teachers, right? And hire from within your community, again, so that students see themselves reflected in the classroom leadership, right? There are also, of course, there's lots of work to be done on family and community engagement. Oftentimes, I think we talk about gaps in opportunity. Some of that is driven by the beliefs of, frankly, adults in the system who look at kids and think that the interest is not there. We don't ask kids what it is they're interested in. We don't ask families what it is they want. We now have thousands upon thousands of dollars, or millions upon millions of dollars, frankly, that a lot of districts don't know how to spend. Let's ask families and communities about how to use those resources. And then thirdly, there's a real opportunity also to build strong partnerships with higher education institutions and with businesses. Jamie, I'm sure, can talk to this much better than I can, but the reality is that right now we're not doing a good enough job of telling kids what they need to know and what they need to do to be prepared for essentially careers post high school. And so there's a real opportunity to build out those pathways and build partnerships with local higher ed institutions and businesses that can help support that work.
We have a couple attendee questions about this funding that maybe Natasha, you could help answer. One is, what is short-term funding? 1 year, 3 years, how long most districts are going to have to spend this? And then the other question is whether this funding is strictly for districts. So whether schools are choosing where to put the funding or whether districts are going to be assigning that for schools.
Sure. So there are a number of different funding streams, federal funding streams that came in throughout this year. They're all on slightly different timelines. So I would double check me on what I'm about to say. But my understanding is that the largest sort of bulk of the funding has to be obligated, meaning that districts have to decide how the money will be used by the fall of 2023. And money has to be actually used through the 2024 school year. Again, every time new resources like this come out, timelines become one of those things that just are excessively confusing, far more confusing than they need to be. But that's sort of my best understanding right now. In terms of where the money is going, the state gets to keep 10% of the resources. The remainder flows based on the Title I formula to districts. Districts then decide how those resources get used. They can allocate the money directly to schools and allow schools to make decisions about how to use those resources. They can keep a portion of the money in the central office to run district-wide programs. And sort of what those percentage breakdowns are, I believe, is fairly flexible at the district level.
I'm just going to jump in and add, I think Natasha is right that it's about 3 years, but I think depending upon what it is, there could be different guidance. And I'm in New York State, but I was just going to give an example for, one particular idea. We have funding in our local school district for pre-K, which we've never had before. And so there is an X amount of dollars specifically for pre-K and to be used in, X number of years. And so at the local level, the school district is deciding, do they want to run that on their own? Do they want to work with a local daycare that already provides pre-K and build off of that? So those are, I think, decisions kind of being made right now. And I think depending upon each state might be slightly different. But I think the guidance is continuously coming out as after this act had just passed. So just wanted to add that piece.
Thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit about barriers to STEM education. According to Pew Research, about half of adults, 52%, say that the main reason that young people don't pursue STEM degrees is simply because they think the subjects are too hard. I'd love to talk about how we can use policy to break those barriers and misconceptions, and also what we're seeing when those barriers aren't broken and we end up with young adults that aren't pursuing careers simply because they think that they're too difficult. Jamie, you're the one that's seeing the product of the educational system as they come into the workforce. What are you looking for, and what can we give students to help them consider STEM as a career option?
Sure. So I can't answer necessarily from a policy standpoint, but from a, how we influence students at whatever stage they're at. I think if we reframe STEM into the idea of embracing change, that it's really about that idea of being a lifelong learner, and because the STEM fields evolve very quickly. It's kind of there's a ton of research happening there, and having interest in change and constant learning. I think those are areas that will help encourage people. I think sometimes we're shifting students away from the STEM fields because we're shifting to them because they have an aptitude in something else. So when you have a really great communicator or a great writer, that they say, well, I'm not a STEM person because I'm this other thing. And in my field in particular, one of the areas that is most important is being able to articulate that highly technical concept to someone who isn't in the field. Being able to translate, basically. And so there's a need for people who are really great communicators. You have to have an understanding of the STEM field in order to translate it, if you will. I guess the idea from an opportunity that I think that we're, in addition to just having broad availability, it's also encouraging those who think that either their aptitude is somewhere else or that maybe that field is too hard, that it's, we need ambassadors to STEM as much as we need those who are doing the deepest, most complex research as well. So there's a place for everyone, and I think starting with the areas of lifelong learning and embracing change, and making technology not a scary thing but really a positive thing helps to build that bridge.
It's interesting because I think we've seen that firsthand with the pandemic. Someone that's in journalism in a communication field, it's been really valuable to have people that can easily explain what an mRNA vaccine is, or early in the pandemic, how it was spreading, what transmission is. And all of that comes from, like you said, having people that know that having an aptitude in one thing doesn't mean that you can't in another, and that you can't merge those things. Do you feel that the young adults that you work with are mostly people that do think about it in that way, that have been able to kind of merge skills?
Yeah, it's interesting. I look at our sales professionals because they're most commonly kind of the combination of both, and they come to us in two different paths. One is that highly technical, likely an engineering education formally, so they totally embraced the STEM. And the other path that they come to us is maybe with a business degree, they were a marketing major or interested more in management or operational management, and so they may not have the technical side. And so I've seen both be highly successful, but acknowledging, how you need both to do that job well. So you can't be all the way in on either end of the spectrum. I think it's a similar sort of thing where those types of, and even the most technical jobs now in our organization, you still have to be able to effectively communicate, whether it's to a client that you're working with, because your day-to-day client may have that same level of technical expertise that you as a highly technical employee have, but they are going to need to be able to articulate it within their organization. If they're in a technical role, they may need to a finance person or to public relations, and so that we're obligated to be able to have all of those skills, not just the ones that may have come through a formal STEM education.
We received a reader question that speaks a little bit to the barriers, and one of them is the gender gap. Interestingly enough, to go back to our after school question, the data that we had pulled had found that after school programs are often attended pretty similarly among boys and girls. But it's been well documented and well known that as far as pursuing STEM fields, there often still is a gender gap. There often are more men, both in STEM fields and pursuing STEM higher education. What can we do about that gap? Is the gap, the person asked, is the gap really closing? So is some of the optimism we hear fitting, and is policy helping to close the gap?
Just from a workforce perspective, I would tell you that the gap is closing more slowly in some areas than in others. And I would, as a woman in a field where there aren't a lot of women, I can tell you that my experience is that it's not a pipeline issue. There's tons of folks coming out of the education, out of their formal education. But I think there are some challenges in the some evolution needed in the workforce itself. So I think companies like Siemens is hyper aware from a DEI perspective that it has to be a conscious part of recruiting and hiring. But the data that we have is that it's not a pipeline issue. In other words, there are people coming out of the field from a gender perspective in relatively equal numbers. I think more broadly, if you look at equity, that's not necessarily the case. But just on that one issue, but it's once you get in where you come into the organization and what your opportunities are from there that we still have work to do. So that's about kind of from my perspective.
I'll just add that there's a test that was developed in the 70s called the Draw Scientist test. And so, when it first came out, they would ask students to draw what they thought a scientist looked like. And it would be an older white male with kind of crazy hair in a lab coat working in a lab. And so over time, some of that has changed. And I think, like Jamie mentioned, some of it's changed slowly. But now they can still use that test, and it hasn't changed as much racially, but gender-wise, it has changed a bit more. And so that is hopeful. And I also would say, in terms of women going into STEM, that in middle school, that is that's a big time period where girls lose interest. And so I was working on a project on an NSF's grant about introducing the engineering careers, specifically women engineers, at the middle school level. And so that was, just to engage students, to show them what that job is. We've talked before about, at that level, students might know what a teacher is, they might know what a doctor is, and they know what these other jobs look like, but they don't know what an engineer does. I can still talk to adults today that I'm not really sure what they do. And so if we don't give them that opportunity there, it's closing doors, right? They might be interested, they just don't know what they don't know yet.
Seema, you just touched really well on what the next thing I was going to ask was what we can do to close that, kind of what Jamie was speaking about in terms of people entering the workforce and not necessarily knowing how to merge their multiple skill sets. What we can do on the educational level from the time kids are kids to help merge that early on. I don't know if you want to continue with what you were saying, or Natasha, if you have anything to throw in.
Sure, I can just add that I think Natasha mentioned it earlier about having science play out in the news in front of us. So as parents, we can have these conversations with our kids, and if we work with students about the nature of science. And so there is a perception or a myth that science is completely objective, and we see this past year that that's just not true. There's a social, cultural, political aspect of science. We know, like, certain things get funded, right, while other things don't. Those opinions matter in terms of policy. So I would say having those discussions, talking to local organizations and finding out how they could be leveraged for programs that already exist. And, I think somebody mentioned before, if we're not able to commit, fully to, being on a school board or something like that, finding an issue that matters to you and volunteering and going and speaking up. I think someone asked in one of the questions in the Q&A here, which I didn't get to answer, has to do with this. Instead of just writing to policymakers, which might take a while, use technology and use the internet to your advantage. Use social media and news to your advantage and speak up publicly about that. That is the best way to draw attention. And so, you know, the policy stuff might follow a little bit later, but you can bring attention by volunteering and speaking up. And I know it's super uncomfortable at first to do it, but as you do it and you begin to become more comfortable in asking questions, I think you're taking more seriously that this is something we have to answer. It's not going away. And so it's hard to do that initially, but I think stepping up and speaking out about it.
Absolutely second everything that Seema said. I would also add, you know, I think we know that inequities really come from a combination of policy, practice, all of which are tangled up in beliefs. And so, you know, when we look at, for example, inequities within our education system and access to STEM courses, some of that is driven by policy at the level of funding. For example, some schools and districts do not have the resources to hire the number of educators they need to offer as wide a variety of classes, for example, or the lab equipment or lab space, frankly, in the schools to provide the kinds of learning opportunities that other kids take for granted. And we know that those kind of lower funded districts tend to be the ones serving the most of our Black and Brown students, most of our economically disadvantaged students, right? So there's those structural pieces, and we know that you know, right now we again have this immense opportunity with ARPA funding and other federal dollars to help turn some of those patterns around. But then even when classes are offered, oftentimes we see disparities in who gets to be in those classes, right? And those disparities happen both along racial and class lines. They also happen along gender lines, especially in STEM. And that really becomes a question of what are the underlying reasons for those differences in access. It's not about kids' interest. Right? Let's be clear. If kids know that these opportunities exist, if they see themselves as kind of being eligible for those opportunities, they will pursue them. So this is about the messages that kids are being sent. This is about who, you know, we see as being sort of promising in a space, who's being directed and encouraged to go into these spaces, right? It's also about sometimes well-intentioned, sometimes the way that these beliefs come, you know, and steer students away from opportunities starts from good intentions, from protecting students, for example. Maybe your course load is too complex, too hard. Maybe don't take this really tough class, right? And the problem is that, you know, we're making assumptions about kids' abilities to balance a range of responsibilities and sometimes steering them away from opportunity. And again, we know because of implicit biases and so forth, which kids are subject to that kind of steering more so than others. So again, there's a lot of, so one of the things we can do through policy is create guardrails against some of these things that happened with through belief, however well-intentioned. Make courses that are opt-in opt-out instead of opt-in, right? We automatically enroll you in this math class. You can opt out if you really want to, but you have to take that step and you have to have a conversation with your guidance counselor. Look at data and continuously monitor data to see which classes are being offered, who's in them, and constantly question what are the things within the school building that are contributing to those disparities that we see. And as advocates from outside, as I said, again, one of the most powerful things we can do is also look at that data and ask those questions. Because sometimes the conversations are happening and sometimes they aren't, frankly, because sometimes those data are not being looked at all, even though they may be available.
For me, it's as a parent, and I've learned so much from my other panel members today, so thank you for that. But I also wanted to add, I think there's a role for private business as well in this, and I can tell you from personal experience that sometimes it's a challenge to figure out how to build that bridge, particularly for large employers. The idea of coming up with a huge, program, even on a regional basis, can be daunting. But there's opportunity in small interactions. I think almost immediately, things that can be done on whether it's a single day engagement with a traditional classroom or an after school program or something more broad, that I would encourage those with interest to reach out and build those bridges, because I know I've gone the other way where I've reached out to, say, a technical high school and said, we are looking for ways to build bridges, and everyone was excited, but we couldn't kind of figure out how to make it happen. So if you're, I think if there's interest and there's a little bit of ingenuity, that it can be done on a small scale and then perhaps amplified or grown onto a larger scale. But I do think there is an opportunity there for it creates the chance for students who may not know what engineering is or may not see themselves in a STEM field to meet people who maybe shared that same feeling at that stage, and to say, oh, I didn't even know that was a thing, or I didn't know that this was something that I could learn more about. So I would recommend building another way to build a bridge is that public to private or educational institution to private industry.
Absolutely. So we have a few reader questions that I'm going to ask, not reader, I'm used to saying reader, a few attendee questions. If anyone thinks of anything else, feel free to use the little Q&A bubble at the bottom. We will still be taking questions through the end of the webinar. We have one question from somebody asking, again, in the realm of what they can do, what parents can do, are there any parent advocacy groups that they can join to help push for more STEM education and more programs?
I think Natasha mentioned this earlier about following the money. So, if a school district says that they care about XYZ, hold them accountable. What are they doing to provide support or opportunities for XYZ? And so sometimes there are opportunities that exist that people might not know about until they start poking around and asking questions. There might be, a pot of money specifically for some, a STEM group or an activity, et cetera. But until people go and ask for it, then it's not being offered up. And so really pushing and seeing what money is being spent on. In the spring is usually when schools do their budgets for the following year. And so that is the opportunity to speak up and get involved in statements that school districts put out. Well, now let's see what money or what supports are actually there, because it's easy to make those statements, but then actually put the money behind it to build those programs or to support the students in other ways is another story. And so don't just, listen, but go and speak up and ask questions. I know we've said it before, but it's really putting them on the spot. A lot of, at least in our district, our school board meetings are public, or there's public comments. You can go and put it out there. A lot of times people aren't aware until somebody else brings up an issue, or unless somebody else writes in a public comment, and then they're aware, oh, I also care about this. So be that person that speaks up. And you still have to probably maybe write the different levels of letters for policy, but there's opportunities at schools too for task forces for parents to get involved, or building level cabinets where parents can get involved. We had a start time change task force at our school district where a lot of parents were involved, because we knew the research shows that later start time for high school students is better for them. Medically it shows that. So, but these are big changes to make, right, that impact everybody. So find what you're passionate, what is important to you, and be involved.
I would say also check out your local PTA, obviously. Some districts have local school councils too, so you can actually apply to be part of the council that makes decisions about the programming that that a specific school offers. Districts sometimes also have parent committees for different kind of types of decision making. There are also lots of local advocacy organizations. It's hard to kind of, without knowing where this particular individual is from, to recommend a specific organization, but they if you Google kind of parent organizations in the town that you are in, you might find one that's already there. Facebook groups also are becoming and increasingly becoming an organizing tool. In addition to that, there are some kind of broader, there's the National PTA, of course. There's also an organization called the National Parents Union, which is an affiliation of lots of family advocacy groups. Definitely check them out. And within Massachusetts, also one of the National Parents Union affiliates is Massachusetts Parents United. Take a look at their website too. They also do lots and lots of advocacy work, particularly for advancing opportunity for students who've just been underserved in our school for a really long time.
Great. Jamie, this question might be best for you. We have a question from someone who works for the Mass Higher Greater Lowell Workforce Board, who said, I work in area high schools and my role is to solicit new STEAM relationships. My question is, are there virtual internships for students this summer that any of you have heard of locally in Massachusetts? I know most of my students are really looking forward to internships.
Yeah, so I think that I'm sure there are, first of all. I am not aware of any in our organization yet. I know we're part of the internship experience that we've offered in the past has been super hands-on. So part of our work is we're an operational technology company where we're working in buildings. So sometimes that's on a construction site, and that's usually reserved for students 18 and older, just for safety reasons. And then other opportunities are in existing buildings, and we tend to have younger folks in that world because it's exciting because you might be going to, 200 Clarendon, a big office building, or you might be going to a Pfizer site or some other type of business. So you get to see different types of technologies in different types of buildings. However, we're suspended at this point for that type of internship this summer because of COVID restrictions, as we were last summer. And my goal is to be back at it by next summer. And we're challenged to be able to offer that type of internship remotely. However, I know that some of our clients and some of my other members of the Mass Business Roundtable are in fields that are able to offer an internship remotely. So I can work with Lauren maybe to find out where those might be and get back to you, but I don't know off the top of my head.
Seema, what are you recommending? Obviously, your students are a bit older, but what kinds of internships are available for them? And are there opportunities, would you say, maybe more this summer than last, because the pandemic was so new to us last summer, to really get, a STEM virtual experience?
So I think there's definitely more opportunities this summer than last summer. There, in some ways, even though the technology broadband issue is an equity and access issue, but in other ways, it's allowed others to join and participate in things that they may have not been able to, didn't have a car to attend or that kind of thing. So there's the virtual piece, but then my students at least, there's more STEM opportunities for them in the summer to help with local high school students and middle school students who are looking for tutors, or they're looking for some other type of STEM summer camps that are available. And so I think, is that the question?
Yeah, I think Jamie answered it well as well. I think that a lot of the issue that people are having is just figuring out how to have, especially for students that have kind of a ticking clock of when they're entering the workforce, of how to have the experiences that they want to and need to, while still adhering to pandemic protocols.
Right.
Great. So sorry, Natasha, go ahead.
I was just going to plug the work of one of our partners. I dropped the link into the chat, folks. If you're looking for internships in STEAM fields, this is an app that our partners at STEAM ID developed specifically for that purpose. Targeted to high school students and college students. So definitely check that out for more opportunities.
Great. And a couple of you also just submitted recommendations, but through the question and answer channel. If you could just put that over in the chat so others can see it, that would be super helpful. Sorry if you're all hearing that loud truck outside my window. I want to close us up with just one last question. We've gotten from several attendees, probably about 6 at this point. What can we do as community members? And we've touched on this a little bit throughout, but I think that we're all in slightly different positions. Some of us are parents, some are in the education sphere, some are other family members, and a lot of us are many of these things. What can we do to influence STEAM experiences, not just academic, in children's lives, and encourage them to consider STEAM fields as part of their career?
Well, this is Jamie. I'll take it as a parent, but also as an employer who wants to have the best opportunity for students. And I think the two things that I've mentioned them before are really encouraging a lifelong love of learning. That, you know, setting it up that it's not just getting through school so that you can go do your job, but you know, building that curiosity, and curiosity, not fear. So because something is hard or it's new or it's different, you know, the workforce is changing so quickly right now. So encouraging the idea of lifelong learning, and that new thing isn't scary. It's different, and it might take me a couple of times to figure it out, but I could do that. I think at every age group, including for those, you know, who are reskilling, who've been in the workforce before, having to kind of rebuild, but particularly for our young people, that they look at it as this isn't a means to an end. It's a way that I'm going to approach life from here on forward, and that will, I think, address some of the issues of am I good at this, or is this something I should do? If we're looking at it with those underlying considerations, it makes a big difference. And that's when we're hiring now, that's something that I'm looking for, is because I can promise that their job is not going to be the same in 2 years or 5 years as what we're hiring for right now. So, you know, being willing to roll with the punches and learn something new and embrace that in a positive way is a key skill that I would highly recommend be part of the conversation.
I would just add, and I know we've talked about this before, that to not feel discouraged if you don't have the discourse or the language, but you have an idea that you want to share with your school or you know, whatever organization that you're a part of, to not hold back because you don't feel like you're at that same level, that you can't do that. That is that invisible wall, that those barriers, just that barrier by itself, right, is exclusive. So there's all these people who are left out because they feel like they're put in that position where they don't have that language or the ability to communicate what they would like, but they might see a curriculum or an idea or something offered at a university that they want to see also happen at their school. Just bring it there, and, you know, be persistent, and that understand that sometimes you know, the school district might want to, they just don't know that there's an interest, or they just don't know how to yet. But if they know that there's people who are interested and are coming to them with that, you know, that's happened in our school district before. You know, when we're always updating curriculum, and like Natasha was talking about, having curriculum that is representative of the students. And so if they see something that they are excited about and think is important, and they might not be teachers, right, or they might not be working in education, but they can bring that to the school, and don't feel like you can't speak up. That is our, you know, our voice is our opportunity there. So use that to your advantage. And I just know from our end, at least, like speaking as a school board member, that until that happens, that's when I see change happen, is when people come and they persist and they push, and they might not know exactly how the process is supposed to work, but they care about that issue. And I think that's personally when I see change happen.
I say 3 things. One is reiterating the ask questions point, right? So if you can, as an advocate, you can ask questions about both your child's experience and the experience of other children, perhaps children who don't look like your child, right? Advocate for kids across the community to have the same kinds of opportunities. Number 2 is organize. If you can't find a group of parents or community members in your district that already exists that's working on these issues or is open to working on these issues, bring people together. There are like-minded folks out there. I'm absolutely certain of that. And then third, I think, one of the things that I think we've learned over the years is that there's a lot of power in data. Data matter, and they help shine a light on inequities, and we should continue to use data constantly. I would never back away from that. But what sticks with people at the end of the day is story. And so share your story and help others share theirs. Find that student that was denied opportunities to take a particular class, or is denied the opportunity to explore certain STEM opportunities, and help them tell their story. I think it's through through storytelling that we really change hearts and minds. And that is really at the core of this work.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. This was a great discussion, and thank you everyone for coming. I am going to hand this back to Olu, who will close us out for the afternoon.
Thank you again to Felicia, Natasha, Jamie, and Seema. Thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us, and everybody watching. I hope you guys learned something new. I know I did. And thank you again, everyone, for your insightful discussions. So I also want to take this time to thank again our sponsors, Softworld for being our visionary sponsor for this webinar series, and to the Boston Globe for being the media sponsor for this entire series, as well as the Mass Business Roundtable. Our next webinar will be held on Wednesday, May 26, 2021, and we'll focus on the future of work. The nature of work is constantly evolving. The pace of change will only accelerate in the next few years, presenting new opportunities and challenges for the workforce as a whole, but especially for women and underrepresented groups. These transformations will continue to displace many workers, eliminating their jobs and requiring new skills. These transformations will also create other jobs and entire industries yet to be imagined. In this session, we'll explore how advancements in technology are shaping this future and how STEAM education can equip us to exist and advance in this new environment. You can register at our website at www.kidsintech.org. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you again to our panelists and to our moderator. And we appreciate you guys being here. We'll see you next time. Bye, everyone. Have a great day now.